Starting a new drama, which is the last third of the book of Genesis, where we shift from for the previous drama. It wasn't enough between the two brothers, Yaakov and Esav, and Jacob tricking his father. Now we start the new drama, which is between Joseph and his brothers. And the narrative is that the father, Jacob, has 12 sons at this point, and he shows favoritism. He shows love specifically to, or more than everyone else, to Joseph. It makes him a unique garment. And of course, the brothers are jealous. And then Joseph starts having dreams, and the dreams are dreams of power. First, he says, we're all binding bundles in the field, and everyone's bundle bows to me. And then he says, this is the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing to me. Second dream. So he keeps having dreams, and he keeps telling that to his brothers, and his brothers, of course, are jealous. And then at the second dream, father rebukes his son Joseph, and he says, what are you talking nonsense? Because there was the sun and the moon, so apparently 11 stars. So the 11 stars apparently are the 11 brothers. When it comes to the 11 stars are 11 brothers. When it comes to the sun and the moon, we assume it's the mother and the father. The problem is that the mother has already passed. Hey, give me just 1 second. I apologize. Give me just a second. Sorry about that. Okay, so the problem is that the mother has already passed away. So the father tells the son, you're speaking nonsense, because he says, am I going to come, me and your mother, to bow down to you? And like Rashi says, mother already passed away. So, but then there's a mysterious verse. The verse says that the brothers were jealous, but the father, Shamarat Hadavar, guarded the matter. What does that mean? So Rashi says something very interesting. Father was waiting for it to happen. In other words, he wanted that, he wanted the dream to come to fruition, even though he presented it as he doesn't believe it because he thinks it's nonsense. He himself, he felt he wanted the dream to be fulfilled, and he actually was anticipating the fulfillment of that dream, which is strange, because why would the father, maybe father would like to, he loved Joseph, but that the father should bow to the sons, that the other brothers should bow to him, that seems a little bit excessive. And that's what we're going to try to think about what the significance of all that is and why he would want that. But for a moment, before we even start, I'm just going to share the screen quickly and look at the verse. So the verse reads, Vaikanu Vayachav, his brothers envied him, but his father awaited the matter. Rashi says he was awaiting and looking forward to in expectation of what the fulfillment would come. Now, the problem is like this. There's a whole issue here where what exactly does the dream mean? Because the mother had already passed away. So what does it mean that the mother passed that? What does it mean that the mother would bow? So Rashi, in the previous Rashi, has a whole interpretation which says, well, it really was referring to not Rachel, who passed away, but Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, who raised him as a son. But then Rashi says something else. Rashi says that the sages teach right here. Our rabbis, however, derive from here that there was no dream without meaningless components. In other words, even if a dream has a certain amount of truth, there's always something that is not accurate in a dream. A dream is not a prophecy. So even if the general thrust of the dream has meaning, but there's always going to be details that are meaningless. And what exactly that means helps us understand the Rashi. In short, what the Rebbe is going to say is that Jacob himself never wanted to bow to his son, but he thought that that part is also part of the nonsense, right? So just like the mother, the bowing is nonsense, the father is also. Okay. But where Rashi continues, Jacob, however, intended to make his sons forget the whole matter so they would not envy him, envy Joseph. Therefore, he said, will we come, etc.? That's what he says. He says, and he told it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamt? Will we come, your mother and your brother, to prostrate ourselves to you to the ground? So Rashi says, make no mistake, it's not what Jacob really wanted. Jacob wanted Joseph to reach to power and have the brothers bow, but he didn't want the brothers to be jealous. So externally, he makes believe like it's nonsense, and he says, while you're thinking about this, he hopes to downplay it. If he downplays it, the brothers will not envy of Joseph. But the reality is that he felt that is something to this, and he actually anticipated it happening. So that is a little bit of the background. And like I alluded to, it's not exactly clear what Jacob thought was part of the nonsense, because he thought the mother is nonsense. But Rashi says the first interpretation is it's not necessarily nonsense because it could be referring to Bilhah. So that's a discussion for itself, which I think we'll skip for this morning. We're going to go to the sort of the bigger question, which is why does the father want the brothers to bow to Joseph? Even if he favors Joseph, this seems like a little bit extreme. And we're going to get to the mystical interpretation. And the mystical interpretation is going to be that the path of Joseph is different than the path of all the patriarchs as well as the brothers. And Jacob was anticipating that Joseph reaches power, but really what that represents is that Joseph's way of life and Joseph's attitude toward life will reign supreme over the brothers and ultimately will influence the brothers. So bowing doesn't mean they're subjugating themselves to him. Bowing means they're accepting his leadership, his example, and his way of life. So that's at the core of the mystical interpretation. So we'll begin with that part, and we'll see what happens. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. My question is like a more practical. So if father anticipated that to happen, why didn't he teach his son to not be foolish and not to share with the brothers? I don't really understand, because that's not gonna do any good to anybody. You can downplay the whole dream because it's just a dream.
So that's what he tried to do. He probably didn't do such a great job at it, but that's what he tried to do. He tried to tell rebuke Joseph in the public of in the presence of all the other brothers, and he says, "What are you talking nonsense for? This is impossible. You're just dreaming these things because you're self-oriented. You're so focused on self. It's nonsense." So he tries to downplay it for the brothers and for Joseph, but it's not healthy for Joseph to have those thoughts, and we know that it ended badly, right? Well, I guess it depends if you ultimately there's the divine plan. So it's hard to say what if it ended badly or not. That's going to tie into our discussion here too. Okay, so let's see what's happening. Okay, so we're going to skip the first part, which is that sort of a technical interpretation of what parts of the dream did Jacob think were true and what parts of the dream did Jacob think were inaccurate. In any case, further explanation is nevertheless necessary regarding the fundamental message of the dream, that Joseph would rule over his brothers and they would come and prostrate themselves on the ground before him. When considering the inner dimension of the matter, true, Joseph was born to Yaakov in his old age, and he loved him more than all the sons. And therefore it was natural for Yaakov to desire that Yosef rise to prominence and even exceed all his other sons. Okay, we understand he loved him the most. He would want him to be the most important. Okay, rise in prominence. That is still logical. Nevertheless, why was it important that Yosef rule over his brothers to the extent that they would prostrate themselves on the ground before him? And why was this so significant that Yaakov waited and looked forward for it to happen? Right? Shamar could be anticipated. He anticipates, like, I can't wait till this happened. Like, why? It's a little bit excessive, a little bit extreme. that not only he's the favorite brother, but they should have to actually serve him or bow to him. So the first possibility is that what Jacob wants is he wants the divine plan to unfold. In other words, in that family, it was no secret that the promise of God to Abraham, that his descendants will receive the land of Israel, but first they would have to be foreigners in a foreign land or enslaved in a foreign land for a lengthy period of time. So Jacob is anticipating not so much the act that the brothers were about to their brother, the brothers about to Joseph, but that the story will unfold. And apparently, according to this interpretation, he has some prophetic vision. He senses that part of what will lead us out of Israel is Joseph rising to prominence in Egypt. So he sensed that Joseph rising to prominence is the beginning of the story of the exile, which from this perspective is a good thing, because the quicker we get in, the quicker we get out. Right? Not that exile is good, but coming back from the exile is good. Right? I tell that to my kids all the time. They don't want to do something. I say, the quicker you start, the quicker you finish. So in some sense, that's the first interpretation. Maybe he doesn't want the actual bowing, but he wants the plot to continue. And if everyone is, the beginning of the parsha is, וישב Yaakov, Jacob settled. And Rashi says, Jacob wanted to live in peace. He wanted to settle in peace. And that didn't happen because the problem of Joseph arose. In other words, it's the calamity of Joseph arose. In other words, when life is nice and peaceful, it's wonderful, but the plot of history is not advancing. And everybody knows in this family that there's going to be a plot. We're going to leave town. And the quicker we get in, the quicker we start the exile, the quicker we leave the exile. So too much serenity is not good in that family, because we need a plot. It means we're just kicking the trouble down the road, kicking the trouble down the road. So that's the first interpretation. We're going to reject it. I'm going to get to the spiritual interpretation. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, sorry for interruption. I just don't understand how come if Jacob had prophetic vision about the whole story, how come he couldn't figure out that his son is still alive and he's...
So good question. Let's first read what the Rebbe says. So I may be misrepresenting it, but I would say even before that, just because someone has prophetic vision, it doesn't mean they know everything that's going to happen. It's some sort of intuition, just like the dream. You can have a dream and there could be some truth to it, and you could sense that something is happening, but you can't assume that you know everything that's going to happen, because the starting point is that even if something is true, the whole package is not true. In other words, not every detail of the package is true. And the same thing is with prophecy. You may get a glimpse, you may get intuition, you may get that, okay, there's trouble coming, there's movement coming, I sense that something is happening. That doesn't mean that you know all the mysteries of the universe.
Yeah, but it's not the minor detail. It's just whether he's alive or not.
Correct. Let's read what the Rebbe says here, but there's a separate point. The separate point is there's other places that say God didn't want to tell Joseph, didn't want to tell Jacob, so it was withheld from him. God didn't want to tell Jacob, it was withheld, right? Okay, let's read a little bit. It is possible to resolve these questions based on the later statement that made by Rashi on the verse, he sent him from the valley of Hebron. Oh, this is very interesting. When the father Jacob sends Joseph to see his brothers, and that's where the kidnapping happens, it says he sends him from the valley of Hebron. The problem with that verse is Hebron is not on the valley, Hebron is on top of the mountain. So there is no valley of Hebron. The valley has a different name. It's a series of mountaintops. There's no valley. So the Medrash says, and Rashi quotes it, that the word Amek, valley, could also mean the depth. And he says the depth of the counsel, in other words, of the story that God told Abraham, and Abraham is buried in Hebron. So in other words, when Jacob sends Joseph to his brothers, he's sending him, and either knowingly or unknowingly, it's part of the plot that God promised to Abraham that his descendants will be enslaved and then come back to the land of Israel. Right? So that's what he says. He sent him from the valley of Hebron. That Yaakov sent Joseph because of the deep counsel of the righteous man who was buried in Hebron, i.e. Abraham, to fulfill what was said to Abraham in the covenant, Bein Abtarim, between the parts. Your descendants will be strangers. So that is what that's what Rashi says over there. According to this understanding, it is possible to say that the totality of the story that transpired between Joseph and his brothers related in this Torah reading was part of the deep counsel that would lead to the fulfillment of the prophecies in the covenant bein haftarim, the covenant between the parts. In other words, Jacob sees this whole, or senses that everything that's happening here is part of the plot that's going to lead us to the covenant between the parts, which is exile, but it's really about redemption following the exile. So if so, we could say this understanding sheds light, or could shed light, on Rashi's intent in the commentary on the discussion. What was Yaakov waiting for and anticipating? From an inner perspective, he did not see Yosef's reign and his brother's prostration before him as a goal in and of itself, but rather as a means to an end, that through Yosef's reign, the prophecies of the covenant bein haftarim, between the parts, would be fulfilled. To explain, there were many possible ways in which the decree your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs could have been fulfilled. As our sages commented, it would have been fitting for Yaakov, our patriarch, to descend to Egypt in iron chains. Therefore, when Jacob heard Joseph's dream, he awaited and looked forward to the fulfillment so that Joseph would reign, and in this manner, Yaakov would descend to Egypt in a dignified manner. Moreover, as a result of Joseph becoming the viceroy, that aside from him, no one would lift his hand or his foot. For many years, the Jews' sojourn in the land of Egypt would be characterized by peace, honor, and tranquility. Indeed, this became the reality. The Jews dwelt in the land of Goshen, which was the choicest portion of the land. Okay, so what are we saying here? We're saying as follows. We know we have to get to Egypt. And we know we're going to be in Egypt for 400 years or 210 years. And we know some part of that 210 years is going to be painful. But what the Medrash says is that we could have started, Jacob and the Jewish people could have been taken to Egypt as captives. And they could have been enslaved, and they could have been enslaved for the entire period that they were in Egypt. That would be the worst case scenario, but that's not what happened. In reality, because of the story of Joseph, because Joseph became the king, Jacob comes to Egypt and he comes in a dignified manner. And for many decades, his family lives in Israel in peace. And only after the passing of the last brother does the slavery begin. And the slavery, instead of going for 210 years, ends up being only for something like 86 years. So maybe what the suggestion would be is when Rashi says, when the verse says the father guarded the matter, and Rashi says it means he anticipated, doesn't mean he wants the brothers to bow to him. He means he anticipates the whole story, because the fact that Joseph will be the king of Egypt actually helps the entire family. So that's the suggested interpretation, but we're going to say that's not the full. That's not the full interpretation. It still has some problems. Because if you look at the wording, it seems that it doesn't say that he anticipated for Joseph to be the king or Joseph to rule. He wanted them to bow to him. So let's read. This interpretation as well is nevertheless problematic, because the simple meaning of Joseph's dream did not concern the general concept that he would become a world ruler, only that the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars are bowing down to me, i.e. that Yaakov and Joseph's brothers would bow. So again, the problem is like this. The problem is that if the dream would mean Joseph becomes the king of the superpower of Egypt, then you could say that's what Jacob wanted. Jacob wanted that Joseph should rule over Egypt, and then that would sort of sweeten the descent into the exile. But that's not what the dream was about. The dream was just about the family, that the brothers bowed to him. So then when you say that Jacob anticipated that the dream's fulfillment, what you're saying is that Jacob anticipated that the brothers would bow to Joseph. Why is that a good thing? Also, according to this understanding, it is not appropriate to say that Yaakov awaited and looked forward to its fulfillment. This expression implies that he was looking forward to the dream's speedy fulfillment in the near future. However, according to the above interpretation, Yaakov certainly would not look forward to the dream being fulfilled speedily. Why would he anticipate the beginning of the exile, even if it would begin with honor? Thus, it would have been appropriate for Rashi to merely say that Yaakov understood that the dream and its message will be fulfilled, not that he awaited and looked forward to its fulfillment. Okay, so the Rebbe is saying different than I said. I said he would want the exile to start. We're saying, no, you never anticipate trouble, even if you want to get out of it. So if Jacob believed it, say Jacob awaited to see how it's going to happen. Anticipated means he actually wants it to happen. And here this is all a lead up to the mystical interpretation. To explain the above, as is well known, at times the entire Jewish people are referred to as Yosef, as in the verse, he led Yosef like sheep. So there's a verse in the book of Psalms that says, refers to the entire Jewish people as Joseph. By the way, today we're referred to as Jews. Jews are Judah. So again, we're referring to the entire Jewish people based on the name of one tribe. So in other places in the Bible, refers to the Jews as Joseph. And the commentaries explain the inner reason for this is not only that in the simple sense, Joseph supported and sustained them in the days of a famine, but that he conveyed and transmitted his spiritual qualities to every Jew. So footnote 40 is Rashi, quoting the Medrash. Rashi says, why does the verse refer to Joseph, to the collective Jewish people as Joseph? Because Joseph sustained them during the famine. And because Joseph sustained them during the famine, that's why the entire Jewish people are called Joseph. But the mystical interpretation is that's not enough. Because you're going to say, just because one period in our history for 5 years, Jacob sustained them, that's why, till the end of times, the Jewish people are called Joseph. So the mystical interpretation is that no. When you say Joseph sustained them during the famine, it means Joseph sustained them, he transmitted to them his spiritual quality. And now we have to define the difference between Joseph and his brothers, and even the difference in Joseph and his ancestors. The unique dimension of Joseph in comparison to his brothers is reflected in their respective occupations. His brothers were shepherds, an occupation which allowed one to remain detached and removed from worldly concerns so that they do not disturb the divine service. So the brothers were always shepherds. Shepherds means you can be outside the city, outside of civilization. You could meditate, you could be by yourself. You're not distracted by civilization. And that's why, by the way, I don't know if that I was going to say it, the same thing is regard to the patriarchs. So the patriarchs also were primarily raised cattle. By contrast, Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the righteous, lived in exile. He was captured and forced to live among the nations. Moreover, he was the ruler over Egypt. He was not merely a figurehead given that position only in relation to others. In other words, he actually ruled. Pharaoh was the top of the hierarchy, but he didn't really rule. Joseph made all the decisions. In other words, Joseph was invested in the society. It constituted his primary occupation. He had to invest his energies in carrying out his responsibilities. At the outset, when he was in Potiphar's home, Potiphar appointed him over his household and gave everything he had into his hand. Later, Pharaoh told him, by your command, all my people will be nourished. This involved very great and tremendous engrossment in matters of the world. Nevertheless, all his preoccupation did not take him away or even distract him from the divine service. Even while involved with all these matters, he remained entirely at one with God, to the extent that he was actually a chariot to godliness. This is the mystical interpretation. By the way, the mystical interpretation says that this is really at the core of the tension between Joseph and his brothers. That Joseph and his brothers have two different approaches to life. The brothers feel that you have to be secluded from the world in order to maintain a connection to spirituality. Joseph does not feel that way. And then when the brothers see that the father is showing favoritism to Joseph, what they think is that Joseph's path is the only path and their path will be rejected. And that creates the jealousy. That's the mystical way of reading the story, that they were not just jealous for the favoritism, but they were jealous because of what was at stake was the relationship with God. It was a question of how best to live, how best to serve God. Now, so going back to Joseph, not only did Joseph remain loyal to God while he was deeply invested in society, but also, furthermore, not only didn't his intense involvement with worldly matters weaken his attachment to God, he was able to exert a positive influence over Egypt. In this vein, our sages interpret the verse, Yosef was brought down into Egypt as Yosef had dominion over them, subdued them. Okay, so the verse says, Yosef hurad Mitzrayma. Joseph was brought down to Egypt. The commentators explain, let's see where it's from. The Medrash says that the word yarad, it's a very interesting word. The word yarad, to descend, could also mean to rule. Hebrew is a funny language. Sometimes you have opposite words, opposite meanings that have the same word. Like in English, you would do it, what's the word I'm looking for? You put a prefix of un or d to say that it's the opposite, right? So sensitive, unsensitive, kind, unkind. So in English, the way you flip the word is you put a specific prefix. In Hebrew, some words, it's the same word, just a sort of different pronunciation, but the same word could mean two opposites. So let's say to plant and to uproot. Root and uproot, shoresh, yashresh, but there's no prefix that changes it. So you have to understand it from the context. So the same thing, to go down, yarad is to go down, to descend. But to descend is also to rule. It's two opposites. Two opposites come in the same word. So that's what the verse says. Joseph was brought down to Egypt. Says the Medrash, it means Joseph ruled Egypt. Because both are true. In some sense, he went down to Egypt. He descended physically and also spiritually because he went down as a slave. But ultimately, his descent means that he rules over them as the story actually happened. So spiritually speaking, what that means is not only is Joseph not influenced from Egypt, but he influences Egypt. Joseph was able to have an effect on the environment in which he was exiled and align it with his divine service. Okay. This is why the entire Jewish people are called Joseph, for the potential for every Jew to endure the exile and indeed transform it to a positive force is conveyed to them and stems from Yosef HaTzadik. In other words, mystically speaking, why are all the Jewish people referred to Joseph? Well, the Medrash says because he sustained us in the famine. Yeah, but it doesn't only mean that 5-year period of the 7-year famine that the Jewish people were sustained from Joseph. It means that the spiritual famine, when we're in exile, where do we get the example or the empowerment to be invested in society yet not be affected? We don't get it from the tribes because the tribes were shepherds. The whole idea of the tribes were we want to create a ghetto. We want to create a spiritual environment where we're secluded. We want to go out of society. So how do we have the ability to actually be in society and influence it? That is from Joseph. And that is radical. And that is, at that time, that was radical. And at that time, that was completely different than anything anybody has ever seen. Yaakov was thus awaiting and looking forward to the fulfillment of Yosef's dream, including the fact that his brothers would prostrate themselves on the ground before him. The rationale is that the prostration reflects bittul to the king to whom one is bowing, right? To subdue oneself, to nullify oneself before the king. Such bittul enables both the material and spiritual influence to be drawn down from the king to the people. So mystically speaking, when I bow to you, it's not that I'm saying I'm nothing. I'm saying I'm taking away my own ego and I'm opening up myself to your influence. Now, Jacob sees his son. And he sees his son not just as an arrogant kid, because he was a little bit immature, so he had a little bit of that, but he sees deeper within his son. And he sees his son has the ability to be unlike the tribes, does not have to be a shepherd. He's a leader. He could be within society and influence it, and he doesn't have to run away from it. And then he hears the dream. All the brothers are going to bow to me. He says, wonderful. I'm awaiting for the time that all the other brothers would be able to receive this influence from Joseph and internalize that. Because ultimately, that's the purpose of creation, not to run away from the world, but to influence it. For this reason, Yaakov was looking forward to the fulfillment of Yosef's dream. He realized that specifically the spiritual motif indicated by the dream would be what would endow the Jewish people with the potential to endure the concealment of godliness that would characterize the Egyptian exile, as well as all subsequent exiles. For all the ruling nations are referred to as Egypt. In other words, the Medrash says every exile is like Egypt. Egypt is straits, Egypt is oppression. So when you say Egypt, you mean all the exiles. So when Joseph gives the Jewish people the power to endure the exile, it's also the future exiles, because they would be under Joseph's rule. He would convey the mode of conduct that characterized his divine service to them, and thereby generate the potential for their divine service of Torah study and mitzvah observance to remain intact and undisturbed while in exile, in a situation of spiritual darkness, wherein godliness is concealed. Furthermore, they would be able to rule over all the aspects of the exile. So that's a beautiful concept. This has a whole different interpretation. What does he want? He doesn't necessarily want them to bow to him, but what he wants is that they should learn from Joseph. Joseph's perspective should reign, and they should bow to that, meaning accept it and internalize that. Okay, I think that will be it for right now. because now we go to another point. Go ahead, Vicky. Go ahead.
Well, I thought that we are already at the end, but I can wait till the end.
No. I think that's the end of this chunk. The next piece opens up another whole concept. Let's leave it for another year. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I had a couple of questions. The first one, even on the pshat level, on a simple level, why can't Jacob interpret that as anticipating brothers show respect to the brother? So just on a family level, because he probably sensed, he probably sensed that there was no proper respect and peace.
So I think that bowing is much more than respect. Bowing means I bow to the floor. That's how people would bow to a king. Bowing means I'm sort of giving up my own personality and I'm opening up myself to your agenda. And that's a radical thing. Usually that's not what's necessary. Usually, certainly to another person, you shouldn't bow to another person. But mystically, because Joseph and the brothers were so different, and because what Joseph represented was so radical, it was so different than the patriarchs. So sometimes you can grow, you can learn from somebody else and grow. Sometimes you have to sort of get a blank slate. You have to say, I'm starting something new, but I'm putting my own personality aside because my personality is sort of incompatible with the new teaching. So temporarily, I have to say, I'm putting my comfort zone, I'm leaving my comfort zone, putting away my ego, becoming a blank slate. I'm going to receive from you, and then I can go home and try to internalize it within my own frame of reference. But there has to be a moment where I have to put myself on the side completely, because what you represent and what I represent are so different. And therefore, you can't just do this gradually. You have to sort of put yourself aside completely. That's bowing, at least the mystical interpretation of bowing, ultimate bittul, ultimate self-nullification. Sometimes you don't have to. You could just say, I have my knowledge, give me some more knowledge. I have my personality, give me some more. Sometimes you have to say, you need a blank slate. There's a beautiful Talmudic story about Rabbi Zera, one of the Talmudic sages in Babylonia. And he wanted to migrate to Israel. And when he went but he understood that the style of study in Israel, the Jerusalem Talmud, is a little bit different or very different than the style of study in Babylonia. So he prayed and he fasted. There's different interpretations, 40 fasts, 80 fasts, 100 fasts, I don't remember, but there are different interpretations. He fasted for many, many fasts, turning to God in prayer that he forget everything he learned. This was a scholar in Babylonia. That he forget the Babylonian Talmud, so that when he comes to Jerusalem Talmud, when he comes to Jerusalem, to Israel, he should have a fresh start. In other words, sometimes the knowledge I have actually prepares me for a new type of knowledge. Sometimes the knowledge I have is a hindrance because it's limiting me, and I'm specific, and I'm in a specific mode of thinking, and I have to open myself up to a new mode of thinking. So sometimes you need bittul. You have to put yourself aside completely. That would be the forgetting what I know. And you do that, go ahead.
Sometimes even to respect somebody, you need to bittul yourself completely.
Correct. But this is like intense. This is like to bow. I don't have to lose myself to respect you. Right? I don't have to sort of put myself completely aside. I could say, I have my perspective, I respect your perspective. That's fine. Now I agree with you. Sometimes people's ego is so great that they can't tolerate somebody else. So for them, they have to put themselves completely aside to be able to tolerate somebody else. But I don't think the Shvatim, I don't think even the simple story is that the brothers were just jealous, but from the mystical story, they're not so jealous, not so much as they're jealous, but they're threatened, because here the father is showing favoritism to another completely different form of service of God that they felt they have no connection to, and they cannot adapt. They cannot adapt to become that because they're so different. And spiritually speaking, they couldn't adapt. The way they had to get it from Joseph is to be completely humble before him. And then they can be open to his influence. And then they could say, yes, I'm out of my box. My personality was not able to do this. But if I transcend that, then I could learn from him. Yeah. So that requires bowing to Joseph. So bowing to Joseph is not just a political statement to show who's more powerful. That's the simple interpretation. But mystically speaking, bowing to Joseph means, can I completely go beyond myself and open myself up to a completely new way of service of God? And sometimes you can't do it by adapting or growing or evolving. Sometimes you need a blank slate. And that's what the battle is.
And maybe we can understand that even on a higher level, and that could probably explain why Jacob was kind of survived the news that Joseph is not alive, that you can understand it on a higher level, that the brothers will bow to the extent whether Joseph is alive or not, they can still accept the concept.
Right. I think
he was anticipating more of on a conceptual level because he didn't know the details, but on a conceptual level, he wanted to know that the brothers subscribed to idea.
Right. And I think even if he didn't see it yet, but he always anticipated the fulfillment of the dream. So in the back of his mind, it was always a sense of hope. And that's why, even though he mourned for his son for many years, for 22 years, there are indications in the verse that he still harbored some hope. When he sent them to Egypt, he said certain things that implied that he still has some hope. So one of the reasons why he harbored the hope is because of the dream. In this story, what's interesting about the story, in addition to the fact that everybody is dreaming, but it's also everyone takes the dream seriously. Joseph took his dream seriously, Pharaoh took his dream seriously, and Jacob takes Joseph's dream seriously. And in some sense, that's the hope. And the Rebbe would say sometimes that I think I mentioned a few weeks ago on Sunday, that for Jews to be able to survive in the exile for that many years, we had to have the ability to hope for a better future, even when it was a dream, in the sense that there was no indication that is even possible. So we had to always have hope, even when it was very unlikely. And in that sense, we believed in the dream. And because we believed in the dream, perhaps the dream was fulfilled and we did survive, and we did come back to Israel, and we did rebuild, because we believed in the dream. Now, it's a dream because logically, it was completely unlikely and maybe even impossible. But that's part of the dream. The dream and dreams, what can happen in dreams are things that are not necessarily cause and effect logic. And but there's always the hope, and that's what Jacob always harbored. And therefore, even though he was mourning for so long, I think in his subconscious, or even maybe in a bit of his conscious mind, he did harbor hope, even though he was afraid to dwell on it, lest it not be true. But so this is a whole other interpretation. In other words, this opens up the story to a deeper dimension. It's not that they're fighting over who gets dad's favoritism, who gets the nicer coat. It's about what's the correct path to be Jewish. Do you have to be secluded? Do you have to be a shepherd to remain loyal to God? Or can you be like Joseph in society, influence society, first of all, not be influenced and then influence? And that's Joseph's uniquely Joseph's skill. And Joseph gave it, or some of it, or different degrees of it, to all of us. And now we're changed people, because now we don't have to be afraid of the influence of the world. We have to understand that we're here to influence it. But all that is a result of being sort of bowing figuratively to Joseph, of opening up ourselves to Joseph's perspective, even if naturally that is not our inclination. But that is the gift that Joseph gives us. So thank you all for joining. That's the story in short, ladies and gentlemen. And we should meet each other in good health and continue studying the Holy Torah and growing in all ways possible. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a good day.